Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're healing trauma, we're connecting with our roots, and we are developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray. So happy to have been hearing from folks about the podcast. Been getting a lot of messages, feedback, suggestions, questions, support. So please feel free to continue reaching out, continue engaging. You can use the contact form on bespokenbones.com to be in touch. Just lovely to know where the podcast lands and to hear from folks. So look forward to hearing from you. And today it is my deep honor and delight to introduce you to Dori Midnight. And Dori Midnight practices community-based intuitive healing that weaves together plant and stone medicine, ancestral and queer magic, and anti-oppression work. Drawing on traditions from her ancestry, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Roma, and her training as a clinical herbalist and interfaith minister, Dori's work is grounded in self-determinism and collective liberation. It is inspired and supported by the work and magic of disability and healing justice and Jewish earth-based practices. Dori lives in Western Massachusetts, where she teaches, creates ritual and medicine, and maintains a local and distance healing practice. And you can learn more about her work at dorimidnight.com. It's Dori with an I, D-O-R-I, midnight.com. Dori, it's so great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's really lovely to get to talk with you. I've been listening to you, so it's really sweet to get to meet you this way.
You know, you do so much work with stones and herbs and plants and magic and queers. And so we're going to be talking about all that today. One thing I would love, all of it, we're going to cover all of it. I would love to just have you start by just talking about how you hold magic as an ancestral inheritance.
So this is such a beautiful question. And I think, I think you probably have experienced this too, that there's, feels like there's this resurgence of people really interested in connecting to ancestors. And also with that, this just a lot of interest and attention on ancestral trauma and ways in which that manifests in our bodies and in our experiences. And it's so interesting to me that that's what's been getting a lot of attention in the world, that people, I think there's a lot more conversations happening about inherited ancestral trauma and how we experience and feel and know the traumas that are in our lineages. And yet, there's not as much conversation about our inheritances of magic and gifts. And I think it makes sense. It makes sense that, we tend to put our attention on wounds first. We tend to put our attention on where there's pain. And I'm really hoping that the interest and passion about ancestral trauma can also help us turn towards the magic and turn towards the richness that we also inherit. And then we inherit a lot of times with trauma, that trauma is, for so many of us, the initiator and the path into healing and into power and into our gifts. So I'm just I think about it as sort of like an inheritance. And my own experience of it is, I grew up in a very strongly, I grew up I went to Hebrew school 3 days a week. I was very much like immersed in Judaism, in religious and cultural Judaism as a young person. And I think a lot about, I feel really lucky in a lot of ways, even though at the time there was a lot of pain for me just interfacing with patriarchy and like in terms of the structure and institution of the religion itself. But there was this way that I feel like I received tools and guidance around how to work with some of the ancestral inheritance, like where to look and the stories. And I think as a diasporic people, as a people who have survived with stories, like that's what we've carried with us. You know, there's a story in my family about my great grandmother who only brought a teacup with her from Latvia. And I think about like how the teacup is so small, but the story is so big, the story of that journey, and like what actually that means to bring a teacup and what it meant to her. And I think to me that feels it's a good story, I think, to talk about magic as an ancestral inheritance, because it's sort of like this quotidian or utilitarian object to bring with one's like if you're going to leave your homeland or whatever, a place that was a homeland at one point, to go somewhere else as a refugee, like bringing something as practical and that connects you to your family as a teacup, but also that, like, you know, my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandmother both visioned and like used like red, you know, they used these very quotidian objects for magic. They used brooms and bowls and water and salt and garlic and oregano and rosemary. My great grandmother used to like perk up her plants when they were sick with like a splash of vodka. So I think that it feels like when you inherit something like a story, or when you inherit something like this, like a heirloom, there's sort of like the one surface level of it, and then there's the magical level of it. Like, what are we receiving with this story, this capacity to see, a capacity to dream, a capacity to heal, that as we feel into really like the pain and the traumas, that we're also receiving the ways that, you know, we are here because all of this line of people survived something. And so we're also receiving the gifts and the scrappiness and the resourcefulness that, the luck that allowed them to survive, and for us to be alive, which is just an incredible miracle, really.
I completely agree with you. I actually hold it very similarly. Especially about the burdens and the blessings, right? That we can become so fixated on the traumas and the pains, and then forget to remember that the survival, right? That like when we turn to our ancestors and we hold the awareness of their struggles as something that they survived, that's a source of great strength, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just like, oh, for them, they had to suffer through that. It's like, we don't actually maybe know how they felt about it, but they might, you know, how did your great-great-grandmother feel about her survival? We don't know. It could have been, probably it's complex, right? It's nuanced. We hold the both and it's the pain of it, as well as the real feeling of life, of life moving through life, of like, yeah, this is part of what makes me who I am. So I love that. Yeah, I think about it a lot in terms of, you know, I work with trans folks, and so like how magic is an ancestral gift of gender liminality. So it makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, the same great grandmother that I'm speaking of. So she was sort of like the storyteller in my family. And she, when I was little, I was lucky enough to get to know her as a kid. She was in her 90s, and she was really outrageous and really wild. She was like, went swimming in the ocean as much as possible. And she had these like long white braids that she wore, and these like Princess Leia crescent rolls around her ears. And for her 90th birthday, she was like, what could I want? I have everything. I'm 90. I don't need anything. I'm going to die soon. But you know what I don't have is lingerie. And so she asked to have a lingerie party for her 90th birthday, and everyone brought lingerie. And anyway, that's not the story I was going to tell. But she, speaking of that kind of liminality, when I was about 8 years old, she like sat me down and was like, you're going to carry the stories of the family. And it's basically, she was like, I'm much lighter. The rest of my family is both Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jew, and like are dark, brown, like skinned people with dark eyes and dark hair. And I came out kind of like a lighter version of them. And she was like, you're like, if something happens, you're going to survive because you can pass, basically. And that means you're going to have the burden and the gift of telling the stories. I mean, this is like thinking that comes from basically, like a legacy of genocide, surviving genocides, and are like being connected to that story, where it's like, oh, you need to figure out this plan of who's going to carry the stories. And she said that to me. And I think a lot about it in terms of queerness, and in terms of like also just being someone who passes, like both as femme, as being like a white passing Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jew, like what it means to be able to move between worlds, and like what challenges there are in that, and also what gifts there are in that. And, in like the people I love and my communities of people are queer and trans and gender nonconforming people. And I think so much about like our queer ancestors, our trans ancestors, and like how much access we have when we can move, how much access to healing and to magic and to transformation when we live on those edges, like when we live in the places that are neither here nor there.
Yeah, again, totally agree with it. I mean, I think sometimes we have to get out of our own way in terms of our belonging wounds, right? To be able to claim those gifts. I'm curious because you said about carrying the memories, carrying the stories. And when I went on ancestral pilgrimage, one of the pieces of advice that I got was to be with the stones, because stones hold memory, and that if I could be with the stones and learn to listen to what they had to say, that there was a lot there, but you just had to figure out like what are the right technologies for unlocking or being with it's like a library, right? Like how do you unlock the door to get to the library? So that was definitely part of my process on that pilgrimage, was figuring out like, how do I do that? And I know that you work a lot with stones. And I want to talk with you about how can stones support connecting with our ancestors? So that's the first part of the question. And then the second, I'd love to, I know you have a practice of rematriating stones, and I'd love to hear more about what that is and why it's important. So 2-part question.
I love that you were guided to be with the stones as part of your own ancestral pilgrimage. Stones. I mean, I love rocks. I love stones. I always have. I was like a geology nerd in high school, and I feel like that was sort of the beginning of starting to learn the language of stones. It's so interesting. Like I always collected stones as a kid, and then in high school I like learned about their crystalline structures and like what geological processes gave birth to these incredibly gorgeous, diverse bodies, these stone bodies, these earth bodies. And that's actually been really helpful for me. Like it's been really an important foundation for me in listening to the stories of the stones and learning their gifts and just like speaking their language. And which isn't like the usual way that I move. Like I'm not like a very scientific or like, any kind of like hierarchical structure interest. I'm not very interested in that kind of systems, but it had this like grace and beauty to me. And, knowing that science, and knowing, like, I feel even deeper in my bones and in my heart how stones are our ancestors. So stones, like we share some minerals with stones just as we do plants. And they also carry the stories. They are the earth's like story and timekeeper. And, I think I've worked with stones a long time. One of my teachers, Kabele, who's in the North Bay in Sonoma County, when I worked with her and I priestessed, which was basically like a way of saying like I worked really intimately and deeply with one stone a year for 7 years. So just kind of like apprenticing with one particular stone for an entire year through all the seasons. And it was a really beautiful way of getting to know them and establishing this kind of like, I feel really close to particular stones. And I think, like there's many levels that I think stones can support ancestral healing and ancestral connection. There's just like the kind of like basic, like there are certain stones that that's their gift. Like they, when we hold them in our hand or when we take them in an essence or when we're near them, we connect like that. They help facilitate that, I think about all of the stones all over the world that people use to mark and honor ancestors, like whether that be tombs or gravestones or pyramids in Latin America, in Egypt, in the Fertile Crescent, in Europe, in Eastern Europe. And, it's interesting. Recently, one of my teachers was sharing with me that she read something from a scholar in like the Middle Ages who said, this was like a quote that like a religious scholar in the Middle Ages said, Christians deal in words and books, pagans deal in the flowers of the field, and Jews deal in stones, which is something I'd never heard, but I've been really interested in learning more about like Jewish traditions with stones. And, Jews bring stones rather than flowers when we visit a gravesite. And I think about that a lot. Like, many people bring flowers or a plant, but like to bring a stone is a way of also marking time, the way that stones mark time. Like you can go back year after year and there's a pile of stones. And it's both like very, it speaks to sort of like peasantry, like who, maybe sometimes can be harder to bring flowers than it is to like pick up a stone and drop it as a memory. But I think it also is like the way that stone holds memory and feels like stones are the bones of the earth. And so in the same way that I think like we are like our ancestral memory often lies in our bones, our ancestral wisdom, like we often honor bones. And similarly, like when we honor and speak to the bones of the earth, it's a way of like expanding our ancestry, really, like expanding it to connect and be in kinship with everything that's like even more than human.
Would you be willing to just say one, like if folks wanted to work with one stone for this point of ancestral connection, what would be, I guess everybody has to trust their own intuition, but like what would you recommend?
Yeah. So I definitely am a big believer in like find the stone that works for you. I really like working with petrified wood for ancestral healing. It's a stone that I love that it's a stone that has transitioned like from being a tree to being, so it like resonates with me in that way. Like it's such a shapeshifter. And I like that it also like kind of keeps time in that way. Like it's lived as life as a tree and then transitioned into being stone. So I work with that both as a stone to hold in one's hand, to put on an altar, or to take the essence of. And I can say, I know you asked about the rematriation project that I'm engaged in, so I can say a little bit about that since I'm talking about stones. I've really noticed people, there's like just more excitement about crystals and stones and sort of like flooding more mainstream. Like people are really like Urban Outfitters has crystals now, that you can buy, which is like pretty heartbreaking.
I don't even know what to say about that.
Sorry. I'm really sorry to deliver that information to you. Yeah, they sell like, sage and mugwort bundles and crystals and, it's, capitalism. Like we could talk about that for hours about, sort of new age capitalism. But, in response to what has felt to me like sort of like this huge interest in crystals and rocks and people buying a lot more stores, people selling them on the internet, like through social media, people being like, this is my crystal collection. Like it's like wonderful that people are wanting to connect with stones. Like that's beautiful. And I think what's really hard for me is, and I think hard for a lot of people, is knowing that the mining process, like this is like removing the bones of the earth. So it's both like, and creates a lot of really toxic conditions for the earth and for the people who are living there. It's often people in the global south, people of color, poor people who are doing the mining in really terrible conditions, really exploitative working conditions, for us to have like a pretty collection of stones, and don't get me wrong, like I have a beautiful family of stones in my life. So I made a commitment a bunch of years ago to not buy any more stones, but to only like if people give them to me or if they come into my life that way, I receive them. But I'm not buying any more stones. And then I have begun every month a stone kind of chooses me and I make an essence of it on the full moon. And then I send it to somebody to like either a place where that stone came from. So this month I have this like huge, beautiful piece of turquoise that I've had for about 21 years. And I'm sending it with a friend who is from El Paso, and they are going to bury it on the border. Turquoise is mined in many different places, but one of the places it comes from is the southwestern U.S., on the border of Mexico. And the stone is going to go back to the earth. I've sent a ruby to, where did that ruby end up going? Oh, it went to Afghanistan. My friend Shane, who is Lakota Sioux, is burying this beautiful jasper on her people's land by the Cannonball River, very close to Standing Rock. So I've begun this practice, which I imagine there are more people doing it, of returning stones to the earth, stones that I have like a lot of affinity and connection with, and in hopes to sort of like, give them rest, kind of like let these bones rest.
It seems like a very ancestral practice. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't heard anything about it, like in my own personal ancestry, but it does feel like that. Like it feels like, I get this like feeling of like when I'm like letting them go, like they're dying to me in a way. It's like a mourning process of letting them go, but feeling like I'm still in connection with them because I've kind of like been lovers with them for so many years. And it's just like, oh, I'm like doing this kind of radical intimacy practice of like having all these lovers and then being like, and now it's time to let you go.
Well, it's interesting because they're stones. They can't really, I mean, I guess with a lot of time they could change and shift, but like they're still there. They're just in a different place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know if you ever saw the film Harold and Maude.
Yes.
And Harold makes that penny memory thing for Maude, and then she throws it into the into the ocean and says, now I'll always know right where it is. Right. Kind of like that.
It's true. Like I can never lose them now. I've definitely like lost stones from having them and like, carrying them. I like, would always have these like stones like tucked inside my underwear, and like I've dropped a stone down a toilet, and I like, it's, it's true. So now once they're in the earth, it's true. Like I can't lose them / they've always been lost to me. Right.
Oh, it's beautiful. I wonder, like, does it feel good to turn attention towards plants, your other lover?
Sure.
Yeah. And I just wonder, like, what you have to say in terms of plants and ancestors and the erotic, anything that's in there, trauma, like any of the things that we're talking about that feel like they would be good medicine right now.
Well, I'm sitting here, like I just picked some lilacs from my yard, and I'm sitting here just inhaling them. And I work a lot, there's people talk a lot about how memory rides on the sense of smell, like that's one of like the most powerful ways that we can connect with memory and remembering practices is through smell. And how like just this like simple, like the scent, it's so this invisible road to ride on brings us to a different time and a different place. And sometimes like times and places that maybe we haven't even lived in this lifetime. And so that's just one example of how plants can help us connect and travel through time. I work a lot with rosemary rosemary is known for being a plant that stimulates and supports memory. But it's also a plant that is like particular ancestral plant for me. And, I think like in talking about stones and plants to support ancestral connection and healing, really like where it brings me is like, of course, like what we're talking about here is this longing for connection and belonging. And I think that when we weave connections with anything, like when we weave a connection or weave more intimacy with stones or with plants, both of whom are a kind of ancestor, a more than human ancestor, it just builds more capacity for connection. And sometimes I think that working with plants and stones for people is really nourishing because I think ancestral work can sometimes feel both really daunting, but also like we're so cerebral in like many of us are so cerebral. Or like, what does that mean? Like, is like my grandma going to come and visit me? And, very few, it's like one can totally pray that you're going to have this sort of like classic visitation, either like in waking life or in dreaming life. But so often like our ancestors are communicating with us in subtle ways. And I think for us to then pay attention to the subtle and to bring our attention to subtlety and to allow ancestors to speak to us through plants and through stones, it just like widens it sort of like opens all of the channels for connection and for intimacy. And I think that's what a lot of us are healing from. Like, I know for me, especially like my Sephardic line, like here is like this tradition, this language, Ladino, these like so many healing traditions have been lost because of subjugation, because of oppression, because of racism. And yet I know that like when I connect with honey, when I like listen to flamenco music, when I crush rosemary and garlic with a stone, like something in me comes to life. And I think that in that moment, like if I can pay attention to it, like if I don't pay attention to it, it just goes on. And I'm just like, oh, what a nice song and what a delicious smell. But if I like sort of open up my senses and get into the magic of it, it just like, it's there, they're there. Like I'm being spoken to, I'm remembering things, I'm seeing things. And so I think like as we heal from disconnection, from ourselves, from land, from spirit, from our ancestors, I think connecting with something as tactile and sensory and sensual as stones and plants, like it helps us make those connections, both by giving us more opportunity for connection, but also because I think like it is a way that spirit moves through.
What I really hear you saying is that you're talking about practicing ancestral consciousness, right? Like a thing can just be a thing. A rosemary can just be something I'm putting in my bread, or it can be a moment where my attention is pulled to where I am in the time stream of like, oh, I am a part of a lineage of people who have worked with this herb, and through my attention and my deliberate placement of attention on ancestry, I have more connection. I have more of a sense of belonging. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Am I getting it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, and I think like, I'm sure I imagine like this is something that you hear from a lot of people too, of just sort of like a lot of the people that I work with have this deep, deep longing to connect with ancestors and to connect, like to remember. And, like, I feel like that longing is prayer, that it's like the longing can feel like painful. But I think if we, like you said, I mean, I love that term, ancestral consciousness. Like, I think if we shift our way of being with that longing, the longing itself can like be the thread that connects us to, it's like sort of like when I was a teenage witch and I was first like learning about magic, one of my teachers was like, okay, one of the first rules of practicing magic is that you have to like be in as if consciousness. So like as if this is magic, as if your ancestors are talking to you. And I think that's a really like simple way, kind of like tapping into our younger selves who are like practicing imagination too, like being like, you're not making this shit up, like, what is our imagination but spirit and ancestors talking through us, Like, don't give yourself that much credit. It's something outside of you moving through you and speaking through you.
You are not such a special snowflake. Yeah, I love that. And ultimately, does it really make a difference if I'm making this up, as long as it's helpful and supportive to my process, right? Because I think that there's a lot of I've interviewed a lot of people who definitely like really all up in there with the ancestors, and then other folks who are like, yeah, I kind of hold that as a concept. And I'm thinking of one person in particular who I interviewed for my dissertation research, and he was like, yeah, it's a helpful concept for my clients. Do I think I'm really engaging with an actual ancestor? No, but it helps, so I think it's just when I think about it, ancestral consciousness, I want it to be as accessible as possible. Like, you don't have to swallow any dogma. You can like be full in, like, hell yeah, this stuff is real. Or you could be like, yeah, well, I'm acting as if, or you could be like, well, actually, intellectually, I don't think that's really possible, but it doesn't matter, right? We can all access the medicine of belonging in our lineages, right?
Well, I love anything that sort of like, shifts us out of a kind of exceptionalism or perfectionism in healing practices, just being like, it's cool. Like, you don't this doesn't have to be like an elaborate ritual, or like, you don't have to learn the, like, I don't know. I think like, I think there's this sort of like cinematic illusion of like what things are supposed to look like and feel like. And it's like, no, just like, make a nice altar, or just pretend as if, or pretend it's working, or that it doesn't matter. And it's kind of just like a down to earth, grounded way of approaching it.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that, just like, and it is real.
Yeah.
It's like, magic is real. We're making it up and it works, right?
I mean, as queer people, it's like, I'm sorry, but the question of like, is this real, does not interest me. I'm just like, we're making everything up. I love making things up. Like, we are making up our gender and our relationships. And so it's both like, I'm real, and also I don't care if it's real, if you think it's real.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think that segues us into what I want to talk with you about next, which is queer magic and social justice and healing. And because I know you tie those things together in a really particular way, and those intersections, and anything there that is the right thing for this moment.
Yeah. I mean, well, I recently was asked to teach a workshop on queer magic to this like queer performance class. And I went in being like, they think I'm going to teach this class, but really they're going to teach me this class. And we did this amazing like group collective brainstorm where it was like, what's queer about magic and what's magic about being queer. And then, I mean, it was like, that was so beautiful. And then we did this practice of inviting people to like name what their queer superpower was, like their magical power, as a queer person. And people just said such beautiful things, like from, like my authenticity invites others into authenticity to like, we know how to screw, like, it's just like it ranged this like gamut, this beautiful gamut of like really like dirty, erotic sexiness to like just incredible like access to healing and being between the worlds. And it was just really beautiful to like make space for and witness a group of young people connecting with, I think like especially all the ways in which it's like queerness still can be pathologized, and, especially for trans people and especially for trans women of color, ways in which like the beauty and power and magic is not only not respected, but like has such intense, violent reactions. And I guess like what that brings me to is sort of like, okay, like what do we do with all of these powers then? What do we do with queer magic powers, but be in service to what we love, like loving each other and loving this world. And to me, like social justice work it's not coming from like a cerebral, like I believe in, we're going to make the world a better place, but like it's from my love, my like deep love for weirdos and queer and trans people and plants and plant people and like sick and disabled people and people who are considered like mad and crazy, or people who identify as mad and crazy. Like I feel like I am in service to what I love. And so my healing work is really dedicated to that and guided by that love.
I'm just imagining what it would be like to be in a room with, let's say, 50 other people who all said what you just said. I am in service to what I love. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Like, whoa. Yeah. I feel the medicine of that. Thanks for that. Mm-hmm. Dori, I want to end the interview with asking you to speak about Baba Yaga. And I just want to give a little backstory because that might seem like a random question, but you came to the being on Bespoken Bones through Taya Shear, who's a dear friend and collaborator of both of us, and she was like, well, if Dori's on the show, make sure you get her to talk about Baba Yaga. So I'm asking you about Baba Yaga. Tell me. So I think the reason why Taya brought that up was because I have this, some would call an alter ego. To me, it's like this friend who lives with me, this very old friend named Madame Babushka, who has been hanging out with me since I was like in my early 20s. When I was teaching in this I taught this class called Magical Arts at an after-school program at a public school in San Francisco, if you can believe that. It was very under the radar. But I would, every once in a while, Madame Babushka, who was my alter ego, would come to school and tell stories. And the main story that Madame Babushka would tell is the story of Baba Yaga. And Madame Babushka might make an appearance on Bespoken Bones, I imagine, if asked. But she would... Oh, Madame Babushka, would you please make an appearance on Bespoken Bones? It would be such an honor and blessing to all of us.
Well, I have never been on podcast before. This is first time for me to be on what you call podcast. And I do not understand, but I come and I say, here we are, what you want to know. So you asked me about Baba Yaga.
Yeah, tell me.
Baba Yaga, very misunderstood, because Baba Yaga, people feel scared of her, think she has only one yellow tooth, she only has one eye. Lots of story about Baba Yaga. People say all kinds of rumors, but I know truth because I know Baba Yaga. I'm very old, but I look very young because I have very nice skincare regime.
You're beautiful, yes.
So Baba Yaga is just very hungry because the people have forgotten tradition. And it's not their fault. Very much terrible thing happened to people to make them forget tradition. They forget connection to land. They forget connection to each other. They forget connection to who they are. So Baba Yaga not get fed. People used to bring offering. People used to honor her as grandmother of time. But nobody come to feed her. People forget to feed old women in forest. And so she became very, very hungry, and she threatened to eat the children, who are very young and very juicy and delicious. But we say, Baba Yaga, no, don't eat the children. We try to remember. We try to bring you more offering. We tell you we love you. We honor you. We see who you are and what you do for us. She, grandmother of time, she stirs the pot of souls. And so it's very important work that we do to honor the dark, to honor the ones who live on the edges in the forest, the ones who we call ugly or crazy. Those are the ones to bring the delicious chicken to, the soup, to just ask, may I carry your firewood? Because, I'm no spring chicken. I need someone to carry my firewood too now.
Madam Babushka, thank you. I really appreciate you making an appearance on the podcast today. And I really feel like your message is heard of that what we forget become, I would say, hangry, it sounds like. And to feed and to nourish the darkness, the edges, the margins, the wildness, the feralness, to really bring offerings and rememberings of those parts of ourselves. Yeah.
Yes. You're very wise for someone so young.
I'm trying.
Thank you for having me on podcast.
Thank you so much, Madam Babushka.
Yes,
It's
I
been
get
such
also
a pleasure. I know you get confused.
Yes. I am both. I am, I have many names. Thank you. Yeah. I will now go to my lovely chicken, and I leave you with my friend Dori Midnight.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, hi, Dori.
Hi, Madam Babushka's first podcast interview.
That's super exciting.
She's like, when am I going to be on Oprah?
Yeah, right? Well, I'll put in a good word for you next time I see Oprah. Yeah, so thank you for that message received. I want to just turn attention for a second to some of the offerings that you have coming up in the near future. You have one the beginning of June, June 3rd and 4th in Western Mass, which is Jewish plant magic. And you have another coming up in September called Rituals and Remedies for Heartbreaking Times. And that's also in Western Mass, and it's September 21st through 23rd. And I just want to give you an opportunity if you want to say anything about either of those. And I'm also imagining that there is more information on your website, dorimidnight.com, yeah?
Yes. One would hope that there would be more information on my website. So that will be happening. Yes. And the Jewish plant magic is full, but we're going to be offering it again, hopefully in the fall. And that's just going to be really, it's like beautiful practices of like Sephardic, ancient Hebrew, shtetl magic, making lots of beautiful herbal remedies from Hebrew, Jewish lineages. And then the Rituals and Remedies for Heartbreaking Times, I'm co-teaching with Elokin Orton-Cheung, who's a Bay Area-based herbalist and like amazing community organizer and activist. And this is something we've taught together before, but this time we're doing a full weekend of it. And it's kind of both for people who are engaged in community organizing and change making, who are wanting to kind of like nourish their self-care practices and community care practices through plant medicine. And then also people who are herbalists who want to learn more about how to integrate justice work and collective liberation work with plant magic and healing practices. So that will be a beautiful weekend as well.
Thanks for making those offerings available. It's good work. I appreciate it being in the world. And again, your website is dorimidnight.com. Dori, it's been such an honor and pleasure to have you and Madame Babushka on this show. Just want to give gratitudes for your time and all of the learning and effort and love that you have put into your own personal work and that you're sharing with everybody who's listening. It's really just so much gratitude.
Thank you so much. It's been such a sweet time to get to talk with you. And I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing and helping bring into the world. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Bespoken Bones. And if you have felt inspired by what you heard, it would be awesome if you would reach out and let me know. I want to have the people on the show that you want to listen to, have the topics on the show that you want to hear about. So you can send me a message. You can also go to trancestralhealing.com and you can learn more there about the sexual and ancestral wellness work that I offer. There's also the monthly ancestral healing circles here in the Bay, in other places in the country too. I happen to help facilitate the one here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So check that out if you want. And just keep in touch. Just going to offer a quick prayer to our ancestors to say thank you. Blessed ones, beautiful ones, sweet ones. It's been so good to have this time together today. Thank you for all of the ways that you've guided this work, and may it land so sweetly with you and with the ancestors of everyone involved. I'm Pavini Moray, and I will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.